Welcome everyone to the Edith Wheeler Memorial Library. This is the third installment of Art Gottlieb's lecture on the 20th century by decade, part one. I would like to take a moment and thank our sponsor for this program, the Friends of the Library. Now, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Art Gottlieb.
Hi, everyone. So today we've got 1920 to 29, and I'll show you, I've got a new good luck motto here. I bought this at a tag sale, right? It's a Bullwinkle Moose, genuine Bullwinkle Moose cup, which I'm going to be sharing with you today as I drink my tea. Okay. All right. I have a number of things on my my notes today. So I'm just going to be going down my list. This is like last time and every part of this series. I mean, to understand that the world we're living in, this couldn't be a better approach to kind of zero in on some of the things we'll be talking about. Everything that happened in this period of time created the world we're living in. Things that seemed normal, things that seemed wrong, things that we're reacting to. We're already in like the second, third generation of people reinterpreting events from the period of time we're going to be discussing today from 1920 to 1929. And enough time's gone by where actual people who were there probably aren't around anymore or not able to talk about it. So we're left with something that's over the horizon, right? Over the horizon means that you don't have a recollection of it, or you don't have a vicarious recollection of it from your parents or grandparents. So let me start at the beginning. We talked about last time in 1919, right? So I'm just going to carry that over into 1920, about the dramatic effect that the Treaty of Versailles ending World War I had on everything that came after it, including the world we're living in now. So the Treaty of Versailles, it changed the United States, it changed Europe, it changed the Middle East, it changed everything. It changed the Pacific, right? So how did a war that was in Europe between primarily Germany, France, and England, how did that turn out to be something that affected the entire course of the rest of the 20th century in the Pacific, right? That's something we'll discuss also today. And a few other big things we've got is the Roaring Twenties, right? Which changed culturally the notion of women's role in society, etc. The women's right to vote in 1920, which was passed the 19th Amendment, right? So 1920 was the first election nationally that women voted in the United States. You had 3 consecutive Republican presidents after Wilson, right? Beginning in 1921, which is very important. And also the effects of World War I were to be seen in the 1920s in every single sphere of our existence. And it had a tremendous effect on things, not just culturally, but politically too. We're going to talk about goings on in Europe in the mid 1920s, as far as the rise of fascism, and of course, Adolf Hitler. And then finally, 1929, which we'll get into more next time, was going to be the actual stock market crash of October of 1929. Okay. So beginning at the top of my list here, the Treaty of Versailles. Right now, the Treaty of Versailles was something that was done in a European style of warfare and victor versus vanquished. And then we're look at the kind of discourse we have about war today, and it's inhumane, of course, to bomb people indiscriminately, and we have to watch out for civilians, etc. We're living in a different sensibility that was created um, after World War II, after the Cold War. But the Treaty of Versailles, in the strictly European sense, is part of the old world style of European powers, where if you lost a war, well, you lost. And then we, the victors, are going to tell you what to do, and you're going to do it, you see. And that was something that was uniquely period of that time, part of that time, but it was also something that it was a last thing that was really determined by the old style European powers, right? It's very significant. After that, the next big event, of course, would have been, you know, the surrender documents on the deck of the Missouri in 1945, which was, you know, American, certainly ending the Pacific War. And that had a different character. The Treaty of Versailles was, we're going to tell you, the loser, the terms, and you're going to agree to them no matter what they are. And that's what happened in Germany. And literally, as I mentioned before, it started World War II right on the spot. Um, People are still, even right at this moment, trying to figure out what to do with a situation like that, right? So you hear in modern rhetoric, and I don't mean that in a negative way, by the way, just modern rhetoric. If you're somebody who watches the, you know, TV a lot, and the news at least, the you hear the terminology coming out that if, for instance, if Israel is too aggressive in Gaza, that what you're going to do is you're going to create a generation of Palestinians that are going to hate Israelis. You see, right? I'm sure all of you have heard that. Now, I'm not taking a position on that. What I'm saying is that that actual lesson, as obvious on its face as it would seem for any generation, actually comes from what happened at Versailles. That the terms on Germany were so harsh, right, and so seemingly arbitrary, and punitive and unfair and cruel, that it literally created a justified German people in being so angry that they sought a way to have revenge. You see, that is actually, this is the first time that really happened in the modern age like that, you know, and when we look back on it, you know, this is where that started. So, what the French particularly did was they made Germany sign this giant mea culpa, saying that Germany was responsible for everything that happened in World War I, for starting the war, all of the financial losses and the material losses and everything else. And Germany had to accept responsibility and pay France back, particularly, and England as well. Paying reparations payments and land payments and shifting of territories. And it was deeply humiliating for the Germans, not the least of which, on top of that, was the miniaturization of its military. You know, for somebody like me who studies psychology and sociology, I mean, right there, I mean, it's the Germans were so self-identified with their military, that it could have no other effect to be just completely humiliating. And all of these things made it possible for somebody like Adolf Hitler, who wasn't particularly smart. You know, he wasn't dumb either, but he was an opportunist and a smart person in the sense that he could sense, you know, what people were angry about it, and he tapped right into it. You see, you know, there's a lot of people like that around, and he found himself in the right circumstances to actually exploit that the leftover resentment from the Treaty of Versailles, um, to come to complete and absolute power. Shifting gears slightly, over in the Pacific, right? The Pacific. Remember the Japanese were in World War One on the side of the Allies, right? And they were like the United States and associated power, and the Japanese had sent their modern Navy destroyers to help the British in the Mediterranean, right? So that means that the Japanese were in a position to get some of the booty from Germany after the war because the Japanese, like the United States, was on the right side, the winning side. So in the Pacific, what the Treaty of Versailles did was it ceded German interests and territory that were in the Pacific to the Japanese. And that included three different island chains and also some other rights and monetary assets in China, right? Because the Germans had a tremendous presence up to the end of World War One in the Pacific, right? Now, why does Germany have a presence in the Pacific? Well, for the same reason why the Americans wanted to have a presence, even less so in the Pacific, because, if you're going to be a worldwide power, you need a navy, and if you need a navy, that means that you have to have a modern navy, which means that it's going to be coal fired, and that means that you have to have places that you can stop your ship and re-coal, and that so you had to have a hard island someplace or be able to dock with a ship that carried coal and re-coal your navy. If you don't have that, then you don't have a navy. You see, so the Germans had occupied and taken over and stuck their flag in a lot of places in the Pacific. And all of that was handed over to the Japanese as a thank you for being on the right side of World War One. Now, as it turns out that in the 1940s, the United States fought many battles on many of those islands that were now in Japanese hands. And the US Marines had to work their way from island to island to island, getting towards Japan. And had not those German islands been handed to Japan, we wouldn't have had to fight the Japanese on those islands. So there's that. Secondly, in the Pacific, and this is something that comes from my history as a naval historian, and you don't hear about this much. At the end of World War One, let me take this a different way. Let me just put this in context here. What I always try to do in these presentations and is how is this history relevant? What does it mean to us now? Why is it important? Right now, how many discussions are we having in our own politics right now where it's how much money should we send to Israel? How much money should we send to Ukraine? Right? And if we don't support Ukraine, then that means that Ukraine is going to lose their war with Russia. And then we're going to wind up with a more hostile Russia. And then we're going to have to put boots on the ground, right? In air quotes, is someplace. And now we're in World War III. You see? So therefore, we spend money getting other people to fight because if they at least don't lose, then we won't actually have to go and fight. You see? Right? That's what we're talking about. And the fact that we are going to go fight was put together by something I was talking about last time, which is Woodrow Wilson's announcement to the world and to ourselves, and us accepting the identity that it was the United States' responsibility to make the world safe for democracy, right? So it's just an incredible parallel to what's happening right now in a number of regards. It's still the United States' responsibility to make the world safe for democracy, according to our legacy, according to our government, and our spending accordingly, right? So in World War One, we were, especially in our area here, but just in the Northeast. And Connecticut was a major manufacturing center for anything technological. We had many gun manufacturers here, right? I'm on 95, and when I'm in, I always look over and see the Remington Arms Factory, the shot tower, which has fortunately been not torn down. And we were building bombs and dynamite and bullets and armaments and selling them en masse to the people fighting World War I, to anybody who would come. Now, as it turns out, the British had created a very successful blockade of Germany. And as time went on, we aligned ourselves with them anyway, even before we were really involved in the conflict. So after World War I, the world stopped, we stopped, and kind of had this very introspective moment because World War I was like the Civil War with modern weapons. It was absolute carnage. Hundreds of thousands of people getting killed like in a day, 2 days. Numbers today, I mean, we have, and I'm glad it's like this, but if you have 10 people dead now, or 14 or whatever the number might be, it's a tremendous tragedy. And there's a board of inquiry and there's a congressional hearings about how we lost a handful of people. Back in those old days, you were losing hundreds of thousands of people, and it was just grist for the mill. It was just a normal day. It's really inconceivable, but yet still traumatic for the people who were there, and even for the people who weren't there. In the United States, as was the case for most of our history, was not ever bombed directly. We weren't a place where our towns were having battles fought in the middle of them, and our cornfields and our other places, except for our own American Civil War. But that's not what I'm talking about here. And we asked ourselves, what real involvement did we have in World War I? How did we make it worse? Did we make it worse? If it wasn't for the United States selling all of this stuff to everybody who could take it, did we contribute to the arms race that led to World War I, or the I don't know, the kind of bravado attitude that the warring factions went into battle with each other? Did we contribute to that? Are we, like, in a moral sense, responsible? And the answer to many was, well, yeah, sort of, we were. Um, so even back in those days, I'm talking about 1920, 1921, the United States had this real kind of, you know, mea culpa about what can we do now to, in a Wilsonian sense, to actually make the world a more modern, safe place, right? Where World War I was going to be a vestige of the 19th century and the 18th century. And then we're going to be moving into the modern 20th century, and where we're going to talk to each other and we're going to understand each other. And nobody's ever going to have a war like this ever again. Right. So, in that spirit of things, the United States, who was in the middle of this tremendous naval building program, right? I'm talking about battleships primarily and destroyers, and even a couple of aircraft carriers, as they would turn out to be later on. We initiated 2 naval treaties where we were going to take the major navies of the world and we were going to say that we are going to set the example. We, the United States, are going to set the example by limiting armaments, right? And that means that we're going to take our new battleships, even ones that aren't even being completed yet, right? Brand new ships. And we are going to stop building them. And we are going to either take them apart, or we're going to tow them out into, I don't know, off into the Atlantic Ocean, and we're going to use them for target practice, and we're going to get rid of them. And that is going to be a visual symbol and an inspiration to the rest of the warring tendencies of the world to actually scrap their weapons, right? Literally to turn swords into plowshares, right? And that's what we were doing in 1920, 1921. And we had a Washington Naval Arms Treaty, particularly, and we invited other countries that had major navies. Now, who had a major navy at this point? Well, primarily there were only two left besides us, and it wasn't Germany, because Germany had already been told that they can't have anything but just a modicum of the navy, so they really even weren't an issue, right? The Treaty of Versailles prevented Germany from actually getting into an arms race with anybody. So that left the British and the Japanese, right? The Japanese, right? Us, the British, and the Japanese. And as a result of these negotiations, the Western powers, Great Britain and the United States, had determined that how many ships each navy could have in categories of tonnage, right? So you've got battleships, you've got aircraft carriers, you've got submarines, you've got destroyers and cruisers, right? What size guns they can have, how heavy they could be, right? Which means, how much armor is on them, etc. And they wound up with a ratio called the 553 ratio, right? That the British could have 5 ships, the Americans could have 5 ships, and the ratio was, in other words, the Americans could build X amount of ships, the British could build X amount of ships, the same amount, but the Japanese could only build, from a ratio, 3 out of 5 ships to every one that the British and the Americans. It was called the 553 ratio, you see. And the rationalization for this, right, I'm going to use a psychological term, was that, well, the United States has 2 oceans, and the British, well, they have an empire to protect, you see. But the Japanese looked at this and it insulted the hell out of them. And they saw it as a punitive, racist way of an application of bigotry towards the Asians. Now, that was something that the Americans, I'm not even going to talk about the British, but the Americans, I mean, nobody even thinks in those terms back in those days, and this is something that I think that gets us in trouble today also, is that we tend to see that the way that we're doing things and the reasons why we're doing it as normal, and other people's who have a problem with what we just did, or somehow, we find other excuses to say why they're wrong, right? We didn't have that kind of insight then, and to some degree we're just as blind now. The Japanese did not appreciate being told that for every 5 ships that we can build, they could only build 3. Talking about, in terms of what we were talking about before, about having something happen that creates a generation of people that are angry, that is exactly what happened to Japan, right? In this regard, they felt completely slighted by the colonial powers of the West. Now, remember, 5 minutes ago, they were our allies, right? The Japanese had joined into World War I, and the Japanese had aspired to now be taken in as part of the colonial good old boy network, right? Because the Japanese certainly had their own designs on the Pacific, where they wanted to have their own little hegemonic area, right? Their own power in the Western Pacific, between Australia and Japan, right? What am I talking about? The Netherlands, East Indies, um, and anything else that wasn't already gobbled up. I mean, so everything over there was gobbled up anyway. I mean, so you had the Netherlands, East Indies, which is obviously by Dutch explorers, Australia, which was a settlement by the British, as you know. You had, as I told you, the island chains in the mid-Pacific were German. China had been kind of carved up economically, if not politically, by forces of Europe, like in the same way that Africa was. You see, so what Japan was hoping was that they could become part of the Western club of imperialist countries that had enjoyed sticking their flags in places. And why not? And then the 553 ratio is very important from this standpoint because what it did was it indicated to the Japanese was that we, the West, never really are going to see you as equals. See? And I think that really pissed them off. And I think it was a wake up call to say that we can never trust the Westerners, right? We have to create our own identity, which they had anyway. And we're not going to be part of them. We're going to be adversaries with them. And why are all these colonial powers in the Pacific anyhow? You see? And it really, in a sense, was a lot of the grist for the mill for what led directly to World War II in the Pacific. I wanted to take an angle on this in the way that you probably never heard it before, because well, that's what I try to bring in. And I find this is very important. The Japanese finally walked out on the naval arms obligations that they had in 1936, because they had already decided that they were going to expand their navy, and they didn't want anybody telling them what they could build. And that was it. They walked out. So we knew that there was going to be an arms race. This started in another arms race. And, by that time, the Americans, right exactly at that moment, we started ordering new ships. And the British, of course, were already ordering new ships because they were headed into their own thing in the Atlantic, of course. Right. We'll get to that in a minute. So this is very, very important stuff geopolitically. Now, here's another one directly left over from World War I, right? If any of you enjoy reading literature or the arts, I am not a connoisseur of any of those things, but what I'm going to talk about is the sociological effect that World War I had. If you've ever read Hemingway, for instance, and or seen some of the kind of changes in art that came out in the 1920s, right? You had these, modern art, cubism and different sorts of things, international styles of architecture. I mean, just this radical shift in people's perception of what they're allowed to do as far as their creativity is concerned. Whereas beforehand, I mean, mostly, but not exclusively, people were in the confines of, traditionalism or some kind of a classic guide as far as what society would tolerate. There was a major shift in the early 20s. And the reason of that major shift, as much as anything else, was the trauma that World War I left. In this particular case, I'm couching this in the way that would explain a mental, emotional shift as a result of trauma, right? The trauma that was World War I, and I mean trauma, the kind of carnage that if you survived this thing, what you saw and how you saw it, is something that is going to change a person forever. Right now, in a political standpoint, in context, everybody went marching off to this thing, World War I. Whereas we're going to be home by Christmas and we're going to have this great little story to tell our grandkids. And we died for the honor of the king and for country and that sort of a thing. And it was all very, romantic. I guess that would be a good word for it. And when you were there, the average person, you don't have to be educated for this. Those with any kind of sensibility or conscience or common sense can see the absolute futility of war. I mean, the futility of war. I mean, how do you rationalize there being a person, a reason for you being in some slimy foxhole, right? Up to your ankles in mud, with rats the size of footballs running around, disease, dysentery, and then indiscriminately people just getting shot around you, right? And your buddy's intestines, just splattered all over the floor of the trench. I mean, there's no place in somebody's head for this, in their heart for this, nowhere. And for what? I don't know if you've ever seen a movie called Paths of Glory. I actually turned it into a presentation, right? The one with Kirk Douglas, and it talks about the insanity that was World War I, the complete insanity. And you had the people who were in World War I, who were around World War I. Hemingway's a great example, and they came out of this changed people. Obviously, anything that we understood beforehand about duty and honor of our country is nothing but a bunch of BS. Belief in God. I mean, well, if God exists, I mean, how does I wouldn't believe in a God who allowed this to happen. You see what happened here? It broke it. It was like talking to somebody. There's two categories of people I speak to who were Holocaust survivors. Some of them that made their faith deeper, and other ones that just said, I was a religious Jew all of my life. After this, you cannot convince me that God exists. You see? So this happened in World War I, right? The society said, you cannot convince me that God exists if God allowed this to occur, right? Or you can't tell me that dying for my country means anything, because what I just saw proved to me that it's nothing but it's insanity. And that broke the back of the moral kind of constraints that people had, and the traditional constraints that people had. And then you wound up with, well, why don't I just, I'm Pablo Picasso, I'll just make a person look like whatever I want to make, because there's no longer any dedication to any kind of realism, because who's to say what real is and what real isn't? You see? This was a very dramatic shift in thinking, in culture. Now, one of the ways this had a direct effect on the beginning of World War II, right, is in Europe. Well, like simultaneously to all of this, you have people like Adolf Hitler sitting there and fuming about why Germany lost World War I, when in Hitler's mind and many others' minds, Germany should never have lost World War I. I mean, on paper, they should have won. So what caused Germany to lose? And Hitler took around and he said, well, it was the diplomats that did it, right? It was the diplomats behind the scenes that created these deals that sold out the German people, right? And like, who's in control of all of those deals? Well, it was the people who were pulling all of the strings on all of the governments of the world, which of course were Jewish people, right? So that's referred to as the stabbed in the back theory. And so there's that, of course. And then there was also, by the end of World War I, Germany was in a state of um, like rebellion, which kind of had the flavor of a Bolshevik rebellion. You see, now as far as the Bolsheviks were concerned, as far as Marxists were concerned, the revolution that was called for by Marx and Engels was supposed to happen in Germany in an industrialized society between people who were in charge of the means of production and people who were just the worker bees. In other words, the proletariats, right? And it turned out, strangely enough, it occurred in a more agrarian state that was Russia, you see, but everybody always expected it to happen in Germany, right? So in 1918 into 1917 into 1918, they were like the German Navy had went on strike, right? And so Hitler saw something like that. And he said, well, here's an example of why the communists are bad, right? Now, as far as Hitler was concerned, there was a great threat by the communists because number one, they helped cause Germany to lose World War I from that standpoint because of the strikes. And number two, for Hitler, communism was a product of the Jew. Right? Communism was a product of the Jew because Marx, decades earlier, his family was Jewish, nominally Jewish. Right now, if you said to Marx, "Are you Jewish?" he would have said no. But see, the thing is to understand with this is that see, Hitler saw things in the light of what something that many Americans did also during that period of time, which he saw things eugenically, right? Because we had the Darwinian revolution at the end of the 19th century, and that shifted into eugenics, right? In other words, social Darwinism in the early 20th century, which has come to its peak in the 1930s. And what that meant was that we look at things in terms of survival of the fittest, right? So we look at things as terms of different breeds, different races. One race is superior to the other because they have different biological or genetic characteristics, right? And therefore, if a person is a member of said race, then they have these characteristics, right? So, if you're a black person, you have black skin. If you're a white person, you have less melatonin, you have a lighter skin. If you're a Hispanic person, you're a different race. If you're an Asian person, you're a different race. Now, what eugenics did, what made it very, very easy to come up with an awful lot of stereotyping, which was really just an intellectual way to cover people's prejudices. You see. And for Hitler, and in all fairness, for a lot of other people here in this country, but especially for Hitler, Jews were a race of people, right? Now I was growing up, they were like, all right, so you got some black people over here, you got some white people over here. Some of these white people are Protestants, some of them are Catholics, and some of them are Jews. You see? No. For Hitler, the Jew was a race, a distinct race of people, you see, with characteristics that cannot be changed, right? So if you're a Jewish person like Marx was, getting back to the point, and Marx didn't consider himself a Jew, but Hitler considered him a Jew because it was a race, and you cannot deny your race, right? Now, of course, today, we've kind of created this thing in the last 10 years or so where you could be whatever you want to be. So in other words, I'm a white Jewish man who's identifying as as a female, I don't know, a female African American. See what I mean? And who's to say that I'm not one or the other, right? And that's another discussion for another day, you see. But these things for Hitler were immutable. If your family came from a legacy or a bloodline of Jews, then that's what you are. You're a Jew, whether your family has been practicing Lutherans for 3 generations. You see, so Marx and Marxism and all of the products of Marxism for Hitler were immediately tainted and needed to be eradicated and were a threat because they were of Jewish origin. You see. Yeah, so therefore, once again, the Jews, from the standpoint of the Marxist influence, on the strikes of the German armed forces and civilian workforce. All right. So in other words, the Jews had stabbed Germany in the back, right, from a diplomatic standpoint, from a banking, um, monetary impact, right, and also from the influence of Marxism, right, and the strikes had stabbed Germany in the back and hobbled Germany too. So, Jews became the boogeyman for Hitler and people like Hitler, right? And this is very important to understand in this period of time. Now, getting back to the shift of the trauma and art form at the end of World War One, as I was telling you earlier, one of the products that Hitler saw as caustic in Germany was with the Weimar Republic, which was put into place um, between 1919 and the official takeover of the Nazi Party in 1933 was it was liberal. It was liberal. And it had modern architecture. So Germany had gone from this place where you had these traditional, cobblestone streets and what people walking around with lederhosen and classical kind of Gothic and other kinds of architecture, and now all of a sudden you have these completely redefined modern structures being built and modern art. And Hitler saw this as a degraded thing that was going to suck the character out of traditional Germanism, right? And because a lot of this came from the intelligentsia, right? It was another reason why Hitler was able to look at many of the people in the intelligentsia who happen to be Jewish and say, here's another thing that is actually going to erode the traditional identity of Germany, you see. And that was something that was going on in the 1920s and in the Weimar Republic. Now, in the 1930s, we'll get to that, but Hitler had sanctioned art form, right? Nazi approved art, which could only be the traditional stuff, like the real folksy German stuff, right? It was like anti-modern for these reasons. So another thing we got here, going back to the United States of America more specifically, is the women's right to vote in 1920. Well, that's a big deal. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution. So the first thing I want to say about that is that Black men got the right to vote in this country back in like 1873, I think it was. But white women couldn't vote until 1920, you see. So this goes into a whole nother level of, suffragettes and women's rights, etc. Another effect for the end of World War One was this sigh of relief that the war was over, even for the Americans who really didn't want to be there. This was something the United States was only in World War One from 1917 to 18, right? But it was always something. It's kind of like, why are we doing this? Right now, Wilson made the case to Congress, et cetera, that we needed to make the world safe for democracy, and we needed to rally, and we needed to do all of these things, and we did it. But like if you want to look at World War II, for instance, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, that got personal. That got personal like 9/11, 2001 got personal, right? For somebody who was born in New York City, who used to work in the Twin Towers, um, that was personal. I mean, that was like, I was pretty pissed off. I don't know about you, but that was it had an emotional reaction on me that I wanted to do something about, right? As it turns out, I was too old to join the military at that point. But not about me, about psychology, right? The 1920s were a reaction, right, to in some degree to the end of World War One, and we were prosperous in a sense that we were prosperous after World War II. We were prosperous after World War One. Remember, we didn't get bombed, right? We made a tremendous profit in World War One, as it turns out. As far as our armament manufacturers, et cetera, were concerned. And when that's something like I mentioned to you earlier, it's still a discussion today about who exactly is getting rich in all of this. And is it our best interest to actually be involved in all of these wars? It's something that, if you recall Eisenhower's farewell address, warning the American people against the military industrial establishment, right? So we were flush with money and we were in a new era. It was like a peace dividend, right? The 1920s were parallel in kind of a sense to the 1990s, right? Remember in the 1990s when after the Soviet Union had kind of imploded, right? So you had the end of the Union of Socialist Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, like went away, and you had the Communist Party went away in Russia at least, and there was this collective sigh of relief that a lot of people, myself included, who had grown up in the context of expecting to get blown to pieces one day, right, in some nuclear exchange. I mean, that was a big relief. It was a big relief. It's like, wow. I mean, that's it. It was the culmination of everything that people had fought for, right? That my father had fought for in World War II, right? And got called back for the Korean War. It was finally communism is done, and that's it, right? Germany, Germany, fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, and now finally communist Russia done. And then, well, who's there left to fight? Right, and nobody's got a warhead, right, with my name on it anymore. It was a big deal. In 1919 into 1920, 21, you had the same kind of peace dividend in especially in the United States, right? And you had different kinds of regulations and the stock market was taking off, right? And the average person, right? It's not, usually see these fat cats and all the rest of these people involved in the stock market. Really, the 1920s saw the average person dabbling in stocks. And you could buy stock options and you could actually buy more stocks speculatively on the presumed income you were going to have on the stocks you already had. You see, and this was kind of like the things, it's created a bubble. Right now, the thing is that nobody knew what a bubble was. I remember, and so do you, what happened in what was it, 2007 to 2008. Remember that one? And not that long ago. And well, we had some experience to deal with because we already had the Great Depression, right? But when something happens like that the first time, there's a level of denial in it, and there's a level of, well, now what do we do with it? You see, and there weren't a lot of regulations that we had after that came as a result of this. So our stock market crash of 1929, which of course is the culminating thing in our decade that we're going to talk about today, that was like, why didn't the Titanic have enough lifeboats, right? Well, it's not going to sink, and besides, the law doesn't say we have to have them, so we're not going to have them. We're complying with the law. I mean, the ship's not going to sink. Like, what are you, crazy? right? But of course, the Titanic did sink. And then after that, it's kind of like, well, why didn't the Titanic have enough lifeboats? And so now everything changes afterwards, right? And that's what happened with the stock market crash. Everything changed afterwards, right? And it really created the modern state as we know it today after the stock market crash, going from 1929 and into 1933 with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, created the world that we live in today as far as the regulatory state that we live in, with all of its advantages and disadvantages. And not only that, but a tremendous chasm about people's interpretation of what the role of government is to the actual individual, and what is corruptible and what is really being done in good faith. Okay, that is the legacy of the period of time that was created in 1929. To give you a good example of that, right after Wilson was gone, which is another very interesting story that I'm not going to tell you today. I mean, Wilson was a broken man after, essentially the French and the British, particularly the French, had sidelined Wilson, who had saw himself as this kind of like this moral savior, and some people have described it as kind of like this sort of Jesus kind of complex that Wilson had, where he was going to be president. He had a vision of the peace of the world, and he was going to be at the forefront of that and everything else. And certainly in 1919, the Europeans, they were like, listen, thank you for the stuff you sent us during World War I. Now, please go home, right? You've been a country for 5 minutes. We've been a country for, 100 years. Don't tell us what to do. We're France and England, right? We're the European nations. You people, like, you're just children. And Wilson, he died a broken man. He died a broken man, not just from what the rejection he received on the hands of the Europeans, but also the rejection he had politically at the hands of Congress back home, because all of Wilson's grand plans for the end of World War One, I mean, he just basically unilaterally went and just was going to do it himself, and he didn't bother consulting Congress or pulling them in, really. And when he came back, the Congress, basically gave him a giant middle finger, and he couldn't believe it. It was tremendously humiliating situation for Wilson, who died as a stroke, and it's another thing that created like the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, which is like, do you have a succession of people who are in charge after a president becomes incapacitated? Because most people feel as though Wilson's wife was actually running the country for the last part of his presidency. Anyway, Warren G. Harding becomes president in 1921. Right, he's a one-termer, but he's a Republican, and the idea now is, the slogan was, we need a return to normalcy, right? Which is something that's been picked up in other decades and in other eras, including our era, right? We want an era of normalcy. So that would suggest that something in our way of running a government or our lives is normal, right? Now, maybe even that was even easier to define in now, like 1921, right? Because, I don't know, it's a lot of things that, my grandparents were alive, and they were looking around. If I stuck them in front of Google and told them just to do some internet searching, I doubt that they would find any of it normal, right? So Warren G. Harding was, we need to go back to normalcy. So suggesting that what had occurred before him was abnormal. So what would that be? Well, our running around the world trying to save the world, Maybe that was abnormal. Maybe the United States's newfound desire to go and make the world safe for democracy. Maybe that's not what George Washington had in mind during his farewell address, where he said, don't get involved in these foreign entanglements, right? So you would look at this today, you could actually label that as what Harding had. Today, maybe you would label that as an America First kind of a policy, saying that we need to focus on ourselves. We need to focus on ourselves. We're elected into government to make Americans' lives better and to run the country, to be administrators of the country, not to change history, not to become famous, not to become worried about our legacy, right? To actually run the country like a business. And that created a string of 3 presidents who essentially governed by this, what today we would refer to as conservative principles of a smaller government, staying out of the way of what Adam Smith called the invisible hand of the economy, right? Whereas if there is problems in products or the economy, that it would naturally correct itself because the uninterfered with private market by a profit motive will automatically respond correctly to what people's needs are. If you're doing something or building something or spending money on something or investing in something that is turning out to be a failure and your competitors are giving you a beating about it, then you're going to change what you're going to do. And this is the way that freedom works and that real liberty works, is for the free market to actually do what it needs to do, and the government's job was to stay out of it, right? And I mean, obviously, we've got pretty much the reverse of this now, right? And I'm not taking a position on this, I'm just explaining something. So Warren G. Harding, and certainly Silent Cal, John Coolidge, right? John Calvin Coolidge, who was president from 1923 to 1929. I mean, they governed in this, I guess the term we should use that would make most sense is laissez-faire, right? Laissez-faire means that we're not getting involved, that less is always more, right? So the government is going to try and stay out of the way. And the government is going to try to is to steward its responsibilities by not interfering where outside of the Constitution says you should be involved, and by letting the free market do what the free market is going to do. And like in a Darwinian sort of a sense, if something is unhealthy, it will die off, and it will be supplanted by things that are healthier, right? And laissez-faire just simply means that the government is going to try and stay away from it, unless it has to be involved in it, you see. This is a period of time also where we're, looking backwards in a more revisionist history kind of a way, and saying that it was immoral for government not to be involved, because the government needs to be in a position to make sure that the private market is acting in a moral way, you see, or in a righteous way, a socially just way, right? That was something that was unheard of at that time, you see. It was a different world, not just from the standpoint of business, but the standpoint of society, and here's where we get into an argument about the different interpretations of the constitutional limits on the government, the federal government specifically. First of all, in federalism, certainly in a Jeffersonian way of looking at things, you would want to have governance be as local as possible, where it really affected the constituents living in localities, Fairfield County, the state of Connecticut, New England, right? For instance, where instead of the government having a one size fits all approach for everybody in its perceived control. So here we didn't have a handle back in those days on, well, the thing I think for me was is the most important one that comes to mind, not even more so than social justice, even though we apply this today, is pollution, right? Pollution. When I was a child, in the 1960s, I grew up across the street from the water, and the water was filthy. You know, it was just it seemed as though like the world was just a big dumping ground for people's for man-made byproducts just to be absorbed by the earth. And so right at that point, even for me, without even knowing the difference, it seemed to me that the I don't know, the environment was kind of polluted, and how much pollution can the environment take, before everything is dead, including us. And you had different kinds of, books and things like Silent Spring, I think was the first one. And I forgot the name of the lady who wrote that. But by the time I was, I don't know, what was it? Nixon, I think, put in place in early 1970s, the Clean Air Act and that sort of thing. And, who could say that that wasn't really progressive in a positive way, right? You see, but going back to the laissez-faire stuff of the 1920s, which is the point I brought that up, right? This is, I mean, if you let a business who is going to be run by its shareholders, then the idea of your job as a businessman is to make sure that there's maximum profit, right? So that if that means that if General Electric is, just dumping PCBs into the Upper Hudson, I mean, that's a lot cheaper than having to deal with it. You see, so that it really shifts things as far as the perception of, does the government have to be involved? Because left to its own devices, like Adam Smith's invisible hand, people who are in the process of making a profit can never be held accountable because they're only interested in profit. So the question is only the government the one who is responsible for the morality of things? Because left alone, those who are seeking profit will always do the immoral, greedy thing to the wrong of everyone else. And you see, so it sets up a question right there about, is government literally responsible and must be responsible as the stewards of making sure that everybody's doing what they're doing? Because without the government, then nobody would ever do it on their own, right? So that's actually a philosophical question, you see. And it also has a lot to do with power. And that's the argument even right up to this present moment about, well, the government saying that we have to create more regulations and more this and more that. So how much is that because they really need to do it? And how much is that they want to just to expand the size of government and find another way to be in control of things that the Constitution says that Congress can't do? But if a government agency under the guise of stewardship can do it, then really you've created effectively a law that is extra constitutional, you see. So I'm trying to explain this in a way to put it together that makes sense, even right to the present moment of all of the things that are going on literally right here. Because everything that's going on right here with the Warren Harding administration and John Coolidge administration, and certainly Herbert Hoover, leads directly to a pendulum swing to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the massive expansion of the federal government until it has the reach of absolutely everything, with the justification that if the federal government doesn't do it, then only evil people will exist that are going to exploit the environment and other people. So, and that has certainly led, right up to the even a size of an administration state that would make, I think, Franklin Delano Roosevelt even blush to see. Right. And these things are important because they're the underpinnings of literally many of the arguments that we have today in our own contemporary time. Now, to take a shift back, to 1925. Here's a book. I don't know how many of you have read this. This is my copy, right? It's obviously a reprint, Barnes and Noble. Who cares? It's Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, right? And it's essentially a blueprint about everything that happened in the 1930s and the 1940s, as far as Hitler was concerned and as far as Nazism was concerned. I mean, there's not a thing that happened that isn't completely laid out here. So this was I don't know, this kind of expanded narcissistic memoir of Adolf Hitler. And it was, he was in Ludendorff prison at the time, imprisoned with other Nazis, who those in the Nazi Party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Okay, it was Socialist Party, National Socialist German Workers' Party, and who Hitler had become head of. And they tried to have what was referred to as a government overthrow, right? A coup. And the Germans had, they were imprisoned for it, right? For this failed coup attempt. And Hitler was treated like a celebrity in the prison, and he dictated this book to Rudolf Hess, right? One of his most loyal, underlings. And this book was published, Mein Kampf, which means my struggle in German, by the way. You probably already knew that. And it is required reading after the Nazis come to power. This is sort of like, this becomes a virtue signaling thing when it was still voluntary, right? In other words, if you wanted to show you were with the Nazis or you were on the right side of history, you would proudly display your copy of Mein Kampf in the same way that you would be walking around with a swastika, emblem on your lapel or something like that, or you would be part of, the many different groups that were involved, children's groups, volunteer groups, groups for mothers, groups for fathers, groups for teachers, group for anybody, that would show that you were in solidarity with the Nazis. And then after 1933, Mein Kampf becomes required reading for everybody, you see. And an entire program can be done just on Mein Kampf, right? Which I'm not going to do today, but you can't underestimate its influence. And afterwards, of course, I tell audiences, I said, everything was in Mein Kampf, but nobody read Mein Kampf. We didn't read Mein Kampf. And then it becomes another rationalization because you say that, well, what about what so-and-so read? I mean, he had a statement that he said this. And then somebody would say, well, he's just speaking to the radicals in his own party. He's really not going to do that, right? So we have certain examples of these things today. I don't know. It's kind of like, what would be a good contemporary one, like Hamas, right? For instance, saying that this is, get used to this. This is just the warm up. We're not going to stop until Israel is eradicated, right? So, I mean, is that true? Or is that just something that's a bunch of crazy people are saying to sound extreme and scary? You see? Now, so, we have literally the same sort of a thing. So how do you, and if you have the Ayatollah in Iran saying basically we support everything Hamas is doing, and we're not going to stop, and we don't, really recognize Israel as a state, with all of the implications therein. You see, so how do you actually reconcile, trying to have some kind of peaceful discourse or ignore that those things are said? Right. And it was the same position that people in the 1930s, like vis-a-vis Neville Chamberlain, et cetera, had about what was in this book, right? And the things that were said. You see, now Hitler was, trying to be careful about what he said. He didn't really have much, not faith. He didn't have much confidence in the intelligence of the Western leaders, right? As far as Churchill was concerned, etc. Not Churchill, rather, but Neville Chamberlain was concerned. Um, but yet, here it is. In this book, he let it all out. So, do you listen to what people say when they say that here's what I'm going to do? As soon as I get in power, this is what I'm going to do, right? This is what Germany wants to do. This is what we should aspire to do. And this is why we should aspire to do it. And this is how I feel about the Jews and why. And this is how we feel about races. Um, so it's another example of, is there such a thing as denial? Is there such a thing as rationalization? Is there such a thing as our own spinning things because we don't want to see it, which is fits under the terminology of denial and avoidance, right? So we have that today as much as we have at any time. Um, and this book from 1925 is the king of them all, as far as this kind of discussion is concerned. Now, getting towards the end of the decade, of course, we have the stock market crash, right? So, what happens here? I don't know. If you want to look at the kind of culture we had in the 1920s, right? It was, you've got these F. Scott Fitzgerald kind of characters, right? Taking their roadsters and driving them over the Queensboro Bridge out to their mansions in the North Shore of Long Island. And everybody is drunk and the kind of morality that is going on. If you've ever seen the paintings and the magazine covers, and it's really very vivacious. It's extremely libertine. It's like all of a sudden, if you look at pictures of women, I don't know, during World War I, they're dressed in black, like from their chin line all the way down to their toes. If there was a flash of ankle or something like that, or a flash of neckline, let alone a touch of cleavage, I mean, it would be absolutely scandalous, right? But in 19, I don't know, 22, 23, you've got flappers running around and, with short dresses on and silky satiny dresses, exposing many things that would only been a product of a man's imagination before that, straight for the viewing. And women are smoking cigarettes and they're drinking and they're driving automobiles and all the rest of that stuff. Now, it's probably a certain level of class privilege with some of this, but I don't know. I wasn't there. And but it was really this massive change. And one of the interesting things part about that is if you look at um, going into the Great Depression, certainly by the 1940s, that had completely snapped back into sort of like a more of a conservative way of, you know, of kind of like exposure and clothes, etc. Right. So the 20s are very, very interesting. The Jazz Age, right? And then you had also this, this in a cultural sense, you had this clash of what the perception of racism was and what was going to happen when you took, these scantily clad, drunk women who are doing dances that are connected to rhythm and beat, right? Who are being played by Black jazz musicians. Now you have this sense that this Black music and the rhythm, this kind of like jungle rhythm, right? And even that term itself is kind of racist in the sense, implying that Black people are from the jungle, right? And then you have these women who are obviously tuned into this beat. It immediately crosses over into sexuality, right? Between races. And they were, so it goes into the trope of how white women are going to be subjugated or be under the spell of kind of like this black masculine sexuality, you see. Um, and you can might imagine what that did to people's fears and their suspicions and their, serving their racism, right? And I mean, I was a little young for this. I mean, but I remember when I was a kid, like I said to you, I was in like what elementary school in the 1960s, but I remember the 1960s, and I remember the posters that my older brother and I had on the wall and stuff, and it was I had Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and all the rest of that, and the 60s had changed so much, and there was this tension. My brother was I don't know, he aspired to be a musician. He played the guitar, he played the saxophone. He still plays the saxophone. About 5 years older than me, my brother. But there was this kind of like culture clash between the older generation and the youth of the 1960s, right? Which I experienced vicariously through my older brother and my father, right? So, and not only that, but what was going on around me. And there was this thing about rock and roll, right? That rock and roll really wasn't music, right? Do any of you remember this? It really wasn't music, right? Music was like what's written down on this page. And not to say that rock and roll wasn't written down on the page, but it broke all the rules, and it was happy to break all the rules. And it was going to redefine things. And it came with a kind of, it came with an overlapping behavior that was part of the counterculture, which seemed just like it did in the 1920s, that if you are able to lose your inhibitions like this, then the end of society will ensue, right? So you can only imagine what this must have been like in the 1920s, right? So I made that parallel because that's the way I choose to see it, because I'm wondering, and I think it is true, that there was really a parallel there. So um there was one other thing I wanted to tell you. Oh, prohibition. I knew there was something else. What time is it? Wow. And prohibition had, of course, a tremendous effect on the 1920s. You had the Volstead Act. What was that? I wrote it down here, 1920, right? So that's right in our ballpark. So, and so that created like this, it just fueled this other kind of culture, that we were just talking about, because you had this kind of, in a sense, this righteous us versus them attitude towards the people who instituted the Volstead Act, which must have been these real teetotalers and, these sort of moralistic hypocrite people. And here we are, and we're hanging out in the 1920s, and to get into a speakeasy, you got to have the secret knock, and you get in there and everybody's drinking, whiskey from Canada or something, right? And it's you've created a bit of a bomb, because there's something really, being doing something you're not supposed to do, right, is kind of something kind of like hot and sexy about that, right? Or at least I think it is. And because it's taboo, you're doing something that's taboo, you're getting away with it with a bunch of other people who are getting away with it, you see, and you're having a good time doing it. And so you got people who are drinking, who are spending money, and it's all illegal, you know, which makes it just that much more desirable to do. And it didn't create, but it actually put on the map, right? Where I grew up, we called the mafia, right? And organized crime, right? You've ever seen like Elliot Ness and the Untouchables and all the rest of that stuff. I mean, you created it literally created more power for the FBI under Herbert Hoover, and which is a pretty interesting character, by the way, if you know what I mean. And you had this entire counterculture, and it created it. And Al Capone, right? All of these people getting rich on the illegal transportation of liquor and the importation of liquor, right? And then you've got the righteous people who have made some kind of a bust of barrels of alcohol coming from God knows where, and they're standing there with axes and they're chopping the spigots off and they're letting it drain into the Hudson River, because it's bad for society. You see, and you've got these other people who were drinking who were like, what do you mean it's bad for society? You're bad for society. And many of these things still exist right today. I mean, certainly I constantly see on TV advertisements for medical marijuana and all the rest of this stuff. And, if I have people in my counseling sessions, it's when I'm taking my history on them, um, you know, many people are imbibing in marijuana when they get home, etc. And so what is to say that there's a difference between that and going home and having a drink? So, but here we have the prohibition of it completely until I think it was repealed in 1932, if I'm not mistaken. And so people can drink again, you know. But prohibition had a tremendous effect on the 1920s. If anybody enjoys NASCAR racing, and I mean, NASCAR racing is a direct outcrop from the Volstead Act, right? Because the Volstead Act made it so that people who were creating moonshine up in the hills, right? If you were coming down from the Smoky Mountains or something like that, not that it only happened in the Smoky Mountains, I'm sure it happened in every locality. You're making illegal whiskey, and then it's contraband, right? So you have these people who actually created the first hot rods, right? What they do is they souped up cars, right? They took a stock car and they modified it so that it was faster than the police cruisers of the day. And that legacy led directly to organized automobile racing. And that organized automobile racing became the sports of like NASCAR today. And has a direct legacy straight back to that. But this business of moonshine and running from the cops and all the rest of that is actually it's actually a very large story as far as Americana is concerned. Um, and this notion of alcohol, when I was working with the Navy in the 1990s, I was a VIP and I was on a lot of foreign ships, right? And I went on a British aircraft carrier called the Ark Royal. And, when I was a Yank, and it was the first thing they asked me was, do you want to drink? Which was something that was unusual because on any American ship, they're dry. There's no booze on American ships. It's a bit of a legacy here. There's no booze on American ships, but on the British ships, they had their tot, and it's God Save the King, and it's very traditional. They would have their thing of rum there, you know, and you got your rations of rum, which of course is part of British legacy as far as their own colonialism in the West Indies, right? Because the massive product of the sugarcane, primarily from places like Jamaica, was rum, you know. So today, what I try to do, as I always try to do, is to take something that happened in some period of time and put it in enough context where it makes sense for what does it mean to us today, and what are the parallels, right? Any one of the things on my bullet point list today that we could have done, we can do a whole series on. But, for the hour and a half that we have today, I think I covered the most pertinent things that I wanted to tell you from my point of view. I hope you found that interesting. We've got a couple of minutes left. If anybody's got a question or two, I'll be happy to entertain them. Nobody?
Nothing on the chat today, doesn't seem.
Okay.
All right. Give
So,
everybody, go ahead.
yeah, if anybody's got any specific things that they want to hear about, questions or anything, just send an email or something. I'll get it immediately. And I don't mind, answering specific questions or anything else like that. As always, it's a privilege for me to spend this time with you and for you to allow me to give you my point of view on particular subjects. It's a great privilege, and I want to thank you.
Well, thank you, Art. We are so glad that you were able to do these presentations for us at the library and offer that access to knowledge and information to our patrons. Thank you again. Anybody else have any questions before we go? Just last call.
Yeah. The next one's going to be good also. Yeah, go ahead.
Just this is Rick Smith. I just really appreciate you, Art. Thank you very much. Like I said before, you're filling in the gaps and putting things together. And I got to tell you, the only thing I keep thinking about is the current state of our United States and
Yeah.
whether and how to stick it together. So
Yeah, thank you. It's like I always say, it's people think maybe every generation has this kind of arrogance. It's kind of like, well, those people aren't as smart as us, and what did they know? They didn't even have smartphones. But it's a big mistake. People think the world started like last week. It did not. And there were some people who I dare to say a lot smarter than we are, who were chewing on stuff a lot long, and on which at their core were the exact same issues. The technology has changed, the way people are dressed has changed, but technically they're the exact same issues. And I love the history, and it is so important. It was so important to understand, and unfortunately, it gets heavily politicized and abused, and interpreted and twisted, especially by people who are at the mercy of listening to people who sound intelligent, to recreate things for their own purposes in the present moment. So, well, thanks everyone. God bless you. I'll see you soon. All right.
thank you.
Thank you guys, and just let you guys know, thank you for your questions, Rick. Thank you, Art. Again, our next session will be on December 20th at 2 p.m. If you missed any of the sessions or want to review the previous sessions, they're going to be available on our YouTube page. Thank you everyone so much for coming, and we will see you all very soon. Thank you,
All
Art.
right. Bye bye, everyone.
Thank you.